The Man Who Knew Too Soon, Ignas Semmelweis, and the Deadly Secret of Clean Hands. It began, as many horrors do, in a place meant to preserve life. The Allgemein's Krankenhaus of Vienna, the Grand General Hospital, stood as a monument to modern medicine in the 1840s. Its corridors echoed with the sharp clip of boots and rustle of linen skirts, a place of hope, of learning, of healing. But for the women admitted to the maternity wards, it had another name whispered in terror, the House of Death. At the heart of this quiet catastrophe was a cruel, inexplicable paradox. 2 wards, 2 sets of women, each preparing to bring life into the world. One ward, staffed by doctors and medical students, boasted the best of scientific knowledge. The other, overseen by humble midwives, leaned on tradition and intuition, and yet the numbers, cold, brutal, irrefutable, told a haunting tale. In the doctor's ward, 1 in every 10 women died, often within days, sometimes within hours. In the midwife's ward, the deaths were rare, a fraction by comparison. Nobody could explain it. At least, no one dared to try, that is, until a quiet, observant Hungarian named Ignas Philip Semmelweis arrived, a man not driven by fame or fortune, but by a gnawing discomfort that something was terribly, terribly wrong. Semmelweis was 30 when he joined the obstetrics division in Vienna, modest, intense, with a mind like a razor and a heart that could not abide injustice. He was not the kind to accept easy answers, where others saw patterns and shrugged. He saw puzzles and asked, why? And the puzzle before him was monstrous. Women begged not to be placed in the first ward. Some dropped to their knees, pleading to be sent to the midwives. Others gave birth in the streets, just to avoid the cursed halls, and with good reason. Their chances of surviving childbirth were 3 to 4 times higher outside the hands of trained physicians. What was killing them? Was it miasma, the invisible bad air blamed for so many illnesses in the age before germ theory? Was it the result of cramped conditions, or perhaps divine punishment, as some clergy suggested? Semmelweis didn't believe in ghosts or vapors. He believed in evidence. He started logging the data, day after day, birth after birth, death after death, a morbid ledger of mothers lost and children orphaned, and still, the pattern held. Wherever the doctors touched, death followed. Then, in 1847, tragedy provided the missing piece. A close friend and colleague, Professor Jakob Kolečka, died after being pricked by a student's scalpel during an autopsy. Kolečka's body decayed with terrifying speed, fever, abscesses, organ failure. Semmelweis reviewed the symptoms. They were identical to the women who died in childbirth. A new, terrible hypothesis emerged. Could it be that doctors who spent their mornings dissecting corpses and their afternoons delivering babies were carrying something invisible from the dead to the living? Semmelweis dared to ask it aloud. He ordered all doctors and students to wash their hands with a chlorine solution before examining patients. Chlorine was known not for killing germs. They had no concept of such things yet, but for its power to remove the stench of decay. It was the only tool he had, and what happened next should have changed the world. Within 1 month, maternal mortality in the doctor's ward dropped from over 18% to less than 2%. Over the following year, it hovered near 0. It was a miracle, a revolution, proof that the hands of healers had become harbingers of death and could now be cleansed. But the world did not rejoice. Instead, it laughed. His colleagues mocked him, deriding his theory as unscientific. The notion that gentlemen doctors, respected, educated men, could be dirty, could be the very cause of their patients' deaths. Unthinkable, offensive. He tried to convince them, wrote letters, presented results, begged with logic and data. He was met with scoffs, silence, and eventually, dismissal. Some doctors even stopped washing their hands out of defiance. Vienna turned its back on Semmelweis, and slowly, his mind began to fray. By 1865, the same man, who had once saved thousands of lives, now wandered the streets of Pest, ranting to strangers, writing feverish pamphlets, accusing the medical establishment of mass murder. His obsession became his prison. He was committed to an insane asylum by his colleagues, yes, the same ones who had mocked him. 2 weeks later, he was dead. Some say he was beaten by the guards, others say it was an infected wound. Irony, perhaps, the last cruelty of a system that had always punished him for seeing too clearly. He died nameless to history, his discoveries buried beneath pride and denial. And yet, death could not keep his truth hidden. Louis Pasteur would later prove the existence of germs. Joseph Lister would bring antiseptic techniques to surgery, and slowly, the world would catch up to Semmelweis, though he was no longer alive to see it. Today, every doctor scrubs their hands not out of habit, but out of reverence for a man who saw what others refused to see. His name is etched into medical halls, but more importantly, into the billions of lives saved by a simple act, washing hands. But ask yourself this: what if we'd listened sooner? What if arrogance had not stood in the way of truth? And how many lives, how many mothers, might have been spared the silent sentence of ignorance? The mind, like the body, has limits. Push too hard, too long, and something breaks. After the stunning collapse of support in Vienna, Ignas Semmelweis returned to his homeland of Hungary with a soul heavy from rejection. He had saved lives, thousands of them, and yet had become a pariah in the very profession he had sworn to uphold. Vienna no longer welcomed his presence. Worse still, the hospital quietly rolled back his hand-washing protocols, and the maternal death rates climbed once more, almost as if his success had been a brief dream, easily forgotten. But Semmelweis did not forget. In Pest, he took up a position at St. Rochus Hospital, a smaller, quieter institution. There, removed from the politics of Vienna, he returned to what he did best: protecting mothers. Once again, he introduced rigorous hand-washing standards. Once again, maternal mortality plummeted. His methods worked, over and over, in different cities, with different staff. The results were indisputable. And yet still, the silence persisted. The problem, it seemed, was not his data, but his timing. Semmelweis had stepped into a world not yet ready for what he had to say. There was no germ theory, no microscopes revealing legions of bacteria, no Pasteur, no Koch, no scientific language with which to explain what he was witnessing. And so, in the vacuum of understanding, ridicule rushed in to fill the space. To the eyes of the 19th century establishment, Semmelweis was proposing invisible killers, carried by respected doctors from corpse to cradle. It was not just radical, it was an affront to their dignity. The idea that they were the cause of death, that the blood on their coats wasn't a badge of honor, but a deadly threat, unforgivable. And Semmelweis, never one for politics, did not temper his words. He began calling them murderers. Literally, in his open letters and writings, he accused prominent physicians by name. "You are responsible," he wrote. "You have the blood of mothers on your hands." His tone, once reasoned, became accusatory, emotional, furious. He was no longer just trying to prove a theory. He was fighting a war. But the enemy wasn't disease, it was arrogance. The world had branded him a madman. So slowly, tragically, he became one. His behavior grew erratic. He wrote endlessly, long rambling letters to friends, newspapers, even emperors, pleading for justice, for acknowledgement. He wandered hospital halls muttering to himself. He wept in front of patients. His colleagues began avoiding him, not out of disagreement, but discomfort. Even his family, his wife and children, grew afraid. In 1865, his friends and wife conspired to lure him to a sanatorium under the pretense of needing rest. It was a lie. They had arranged for him to be committed. What happened next remains debated to this day.
Records are sparse. Some say he resisted, that the guards beat him. Others claim he developed an infected wound from a struggle, a tragic mirror of the very infections he had spent his life trying to prevent. What we know is this: Semmelweis died 2 weeks later, alone and confused in a mental asylum. His official cause of death was pneumonia, blood poisoning, likely from a wound, likely preventable. A brutal, poetic final chapter to a life dedicated to stopping such deaths. He was 47. History buried him, just as his colleagues had. For nearly 2 decades, his name vanished from medical literature. His books fell out of print. His grave was unvisited, until something strange happened. Elsewhere in Europe, a French chemist named Louis Pasteur was conducting experiments with fermentation and spoiled wine. His work revealed the presence of microscopic organisms, what he called germs, responsible for contamination. Around the same time, a British surgeon named Joseph Lister began applying carbolic acid to wounds and surgical instruments. Death rates from surgery dropped dramatically. Suddenly, Semmelweis's invisible particles were no longer fantasy. They had a name, a face, a science behind them. By the 1880s, hand washing, antiseptics, and sterilization became central tenets of modern medicine. Medical journals began referencing Semmelweis's work. A slow ripple turned into a wave. By the turn of the century, his name was invoked with reverence, but the man himself, long dead, unaware of the vindication that came too late. Today, we wash our hands with a kind of reverence, not just because of what science demands, but because of what it costs to learn. In hospitals around the world, you'll find plaques, statues, even hospitals bearing the name Semmelweis. In Hungary, he is a national hero. In medical schools, he is taught as a cautionary tale, not of bad science, but of good science ignored. His story is often told in brief, reduced to a sentence: the man who discovered hand washing. But the truth is deeper, darker. He was a man who stared into the abyss of institutional denial and dared to shout, and the abyss, as it always does, consumed him.
The woman who heard the earth cry, the silent spring of Rachel Carson. In the spring of 1962, a strange silence began to spread across America. It wasn't the silence of peace. It wasn't the hush of contentment. It was the absence of something once so ordinary that no one had noticed it until it was gone. The songs of birds, the hum of bees, the flutter of wings at dawn. In orchards and woodlands, in suburbs and farms, the air had stilled, and one woman knew why. Her name was Rachel Carson, and in that moment, she became the most dangerous woman in America. A marine biologist by training, a writer by heart, Rachel was not someone the chemical industry had expected to fear. She was soft-spoken, unmarried, modest, and meticulous. Yet with the quiet precision of a scalpel, she carved open one of the greatest environmental cover-ups of the 20th century, and exposed the poison dripping into the veins of nature itself. But long before she published Silent Spring, she had heard the first whispers of something going terribly wrong. It began with birds. Rachel had always listened to bird song the way others listened to symphonies. In the forests of Pennsylvania, where she grew up, she learned the difference between the call of a robin and the cry of a thrush. But in the late 1950s, letters began to reach her desk, describing something chilling. Entire areas where birds had simply vanished. No nests, no chicks, no sound. And with those letters came something worse, evidence of death. Dead robins scattered beneath elm trees. Fish floating belly up in ponds that once teemed with life. Cats, dogs, even children sickened after playing in sprayed fields. The common thread, a chemical called DDT. Originally developed during World War II, DDT had been hailed as a miracle. It killed insects on contact. It wiped out mosquitoes and stopped malaria. It cleared lice from soldiers and crops from pests. After the war, it was sold by the gallon and sprayed from planes. Farmers blanketed their fields, cities fogged their parks, housewives painted it on their walls. No one questioned it, not until Rachel Carson did. She had spent years studying the interconnectedness of life, how plankton fed fish, how fish fed birds, how birds carried seeds, and balanced ecosystems. To her, nature wasn't a background to human progress. It was the fabric that held everything together, and now, that fabric was unraveling. DDT, she found, didn't simply vanish after use. It lingered. It seeped into soil, into water, into the bodies of creatures great and small. It accumulated in fat, growing more potent as it moved up the food chain. Birds who ate poisoned worms, laid eggs with fragile shells, doomed never to hatch. Predators like hawks and eagles began to vanish. The balance of life was shifting, silently, invisibly, fatally. Rachel Carson could not stay silent. She began to write, not a scientific paper for her peers, but something for everyone. For mothers and teachers, for farmers and city dwellers, for senators and students. Her goal was not to shout, but to reveal, to draw back the curtain, and let people see what had always been hidden. The book she wrote was titled Silent Spring, and when it was published in 1962, it did exactly what she feared and hoped it would. It detonated. Chemical companies unleashed a full-scale assault. They called her hysterical. They said she was emotional, unqualified, even unpatriotic. A prominent spokesman for the chemical industry compared her to a communist. One company executive suggested her book was part of a plot to destroy American agriculture. She was accused of wanting to bring back malaria, of killing innovation, of setting science back decades. But Rachel Carson had facts, and she had readers. Her book climbed the bestseller lists. Americans began to ask questions. Why were there fewer bees? Why had the robins disappeared? Why did so many children have asthma now? Why were streams foaming even when there were no fish? Her words hit harder than 1,000 protests. And then something extraordinary happened. The President of the United States took notice. John F. Kennedy, already aware of increasing concerns about environmental degradation, read Silent Spring and instructed his Science Advisory Committee to investigate Carson's claims. Their conclusion: she was right. The tide began to turn. Congress held hearings. Scientists testified. New regulations were discussed. The public was no longer in the dark. And though it took another 10 years, in 1972, 10 years after Silent Spring, DDT was officially banned in the United States. Rachel Carson did not live to see it. She was diagnosed with breast cancer during the final stages of her writing. For much of the public tour, after publication, she wore wigs and smiled through pain. She died in 1964, at the age of 56, only 2 years after her greatest work changed the course of environmental history. But her voice, calm and unwavering, had cracked something open. In the years that followed, her legacy bloomed into something even larger. The environmental movement, once scattered and disorganized, coalesced. Citizens demanded cleaner air, safer water, protected forests. In 1970, the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, was created, and the first Earth Day was held just a few months later. Millions marched, all because one woman listened to the birds, to the trees, to the silence. Rachel Carson reminded the world of something we had forgotten, that nature does not exist for our convenience, and that every drop of poison poured into a river, every insecticide sprayed across a field, eventually finds its way back to us. But even today, her story is not just a relic of the past. The fight continues. Pesticides still threaten pollinators. Corporations still greenwash their destruction. Climate change looms, and once again, truth tellers,
scientists, activists, whistleblowers, are dismissed as alarmists. The Crason pattern repeats: deny, attack, delay, profit, and yet we are not voiceless. Every recycled bottle, every protected forest, every law passed in defense of the earth, is a whisper of her legacy, and somewhere, in a tree not yet cut down, a bird sings. Long before she lit a match under the chemical empires of America, Rachel Carson had already learned to survive in silence. She wasn't born into power. She didn't inherit a platform or fortune. She was a girl raised in the rural green sweep of Springdale, Pennsylvania, where her mother taught her to listen closely, not just to what was said, but to what was missing. The quiet between rustling leaves, the pause in birdsong, the shadow of a predator on the branch above. Nature spoke in codes, and Rachel from a young age knew how to read them. By the time she was 10, she was writing about the natural world with startling clarity. But even then, her dreams were whispered. A woman in science, a girl who spoke for trees and oceans. It was quaint at best, laughable at worst. Still, she persisted. She studied at the Pennsylvania College for Women, later took graduate courses in zoology at Johns Hopkins, a rare path for women at the time. She didn't have the money, so she worked part-time. She didn't have the connections, so she built her knowledge like coral, piece by piece, layer by patient layer. But life rarely allows one obsession. In her 30s, Rachel's father died, then her sister. Suddenly, she became a guardian, raising her orphaned nephew, caring for her ailing mother, sacrificing everything to keep them afloat. She worked at the U.S. Bureau of Fisheries, later the Fish and Wildlife Service, often as the only woman in the room, the only voice insisting that environmental health mattered. She didn't yell, she didn't demand, she wrote, and her words had teeth. Her 1951 bestseller, The Sea Around Us, turned the tide of public attention toward marine biology. People who had never glimpsed a tide pool began to understand ocean currents and coral reefs. She had a gift for weaving poetry into science, for making readers feel what was at stake. But even then, the real battle was waiting. By the mid-1950s, Rachel began receiving letters, not just about birds and fish, but about sickness. A friend wrote to her from Massachusetts. The birds were gone. The town had been sprayed with DDT. Within days, robins lay dead under trees. Children developed mysterious illnesses. Livestock miscarried. Flowers died. Rachel began collecting these letters, like pieces of a puzzle that painted a toxic landscape. But she hesitated. She knew that publishing a direct attack on the chemical industry would be unlike anything she had ever done. It would make her enemies. It would invite lawsuits. It would provoke smear campaigns. And worst of all, it would place a target on the very soul she had fought to protect. Still, she moved forward. But she did not fight alone. Behind the pages of Silent Spring were years of research, and a small circle of allies who risked their careers to help her. Among them was Dr. Leonard Hirsch, an expert in toxicology, and Olga Owens-Huckins, the journalist whose bird-filled backyard was turned into a cemetery after a routine spray. They passed her data, case studies, leaked documents. Rachel cross-checked everything, twice, 3 times. Every footnote could be defended in court, because she knew, from the beginning, that they would come for her, and they did. The chemical giant Monsanto published a 35-page attack against Silent Spring before the book was even released, calling it unscientific and emotional. The Velsicol Chemical Company threatened legal action against her publisher. Journalists were fed op-eds calling Carson an anti-progress radical. One government official dismissed her as a spinster with a bee in her bonnet. But the truth was more complex, more human. Rachel Carson, often seen as austere and detached, lived a life of quiet intimacy and deep emotional bonds. She maintained a profound, possibly romantic relationship with Dorothy Freeman, a married woman she met in the 1950s. Their correspondence, over 900 letters, reveals a woman both intensely intellectual and deeply vulnerable. Dorothy became Rachel's anchor. When the public assaults began, Dorothy's letters offered strength. When Rachel's cancer returned, this time in her bones, it was Dorothy she turned to, hiding the worst of the pain, focusing instead on finishing the mission. Because Rachel knew time was running out, during the final year of her life, Crason underwent grueling treatments. Her body thinned, her bones ached, yet she traveled, gave interviews, testified before Congress. All the while she wore a wig to conceal the hair she'd lost. She sat straight in television studios, her voice calm, even as her ribs throbbed with cancer. She never once revealed her illness to the press, because she knew that if they found out, they would use it to dismiss her. A dying woman couldn't be trusted. A sick body was a fragile mind. She feared that everything she had built, the arguments, the evidence, the movement, could be undone by a single whisper about her health. So she pressed on. At a Senate hearing in 1963, Rachel Crason looked across a room filled with men who had once dismissed her, and said, "The question is whether any civilization can wage relentless war on life without destroying itself, and without losing the right to be called civilized." There was no applause, only silence. But outside the hearing room, across the country, the seed she had planted began to grow. Women's groups read Silent Spring aloud in community centers. Teachers rewrote science lessons. Families stopped using pesticides in their gardens. Reporters began investigating other chemicals. Politicians started asking new questions. And slowly the story shifted. Rachel Crason did not live to see the ban of DDT in 1972. She never saw the founding of the Environmental Protection Agency in 1970. She never witnessed the first Earth Day, or the global treaties on chemical regulation. But she had pulled the first thread, and with it, the whole illusion of chemical invincibility began to unravel. Still, not all victories are complete. Today, echoes of the Crason backlash live on. Corporations continue to deny environmental harm. Scientific whistleblowers are silenced. Activists are labeled hysterical, just as she was. The same playbook: deny, ridicule, delay. But now, we know the name of that pattern. We call it the Rachel Crason effect, because she taught us that even in the face of industrial empires, a single voice, calm, persistent, evidence-based, can change the trajectory of history, and the garden, once silent, might still sing.
The man who swallowed a bacteria, Barry Marshall, and the medical rebellion that changed everything in the early 1980s. In a sterile hospital lab in Western Australia, a doctor made a decision that would terrify his colleagues, defy medical science, and rewrite everything we thought we knew about one of the most painful diseases on Earth. He picked up a glass filled with a cloudy, foul-smelling liquid teeming with live bacteria and drank it. His name was Barry Marshall, and in that moment, he crossed a line no one else in medicine had dared to cross. Not out of madness, not out of desperation, but because no one believed him, and he was running out of time. To understand why, you have to understand the world he was fighting against. In the early 20th century, and well into the 1980s, stomach ulcers, or more technically, peptic ulcers, were considered a disease of stress and personality. They were blamed on lifestyle, poor diet, work pressure, type A personalities. Doctors treated them with antacids, bland food, sedatives, and in the worst cases, surgery. Patients lived in pain for decades. Some died of complications, others developed stomach cancer, and no one could explain why. The idea that a bacterium, a microbe, could survive the acidic inferno of the human stomach and cause these ulcers was ridiculous, even offensive, to the world's top gastroenterologists. Everyone knew the stomach was too acidic for bacteria to live there. It was medical dogma. But one young doctor wasn't so sure. Barry Marshall, a junior physician at Royal Perth Hospital, didn't look like a radical, tall, polite, and endlessly curious. He had a habit of asking too many questions and trusting evidence more than authority. In 1981, he met Robin Warren, a pathologist who had been observing something odd under his microscope: spiral-shaped bacteria clinging to the stomach lining of biopsy samples from ulcer patients. It made no sense. Yet patient after patient showed the same thing. Together they began digging deeper. They cultured the samples. They traced the presence of this strange microbe, soon named Helicobacter pylori, in almost every case of ulcers they studied. The correlation was undeniable. Wherever ulcers appeared, H. pylori was there, inflaming tissue, boring into the stomach wall. They wrote papers, they presented their findings, and they were laughed out of the room. Journals rejected them. Senior doctors dismissed them. You must have contaminated your samples. Those bacteria are just the body's reaction to the ulcer. It's coincidence. Where's your proof? But how do you prove a theory when no one will fund you, no one will publish you, and the entire system depends on your silence? Barry Marshall decided to become the experiment himself. He and Warren had been studying H. pylori in cultures for months. They had isolated a particularly aggressive strain from a patient suffering severe gastritis. Marshall grew it in a flask, watched it multiply, then one morning in July 1984, drank it. No medical ethics board approved it. No university signed off. It was science by fire, a desperate gamble. For days, nothing happened. Then came the nausea, the vomiting, the pain. Within a week, Marshall had developed acute gastritis, exactly what he had predicted. An endoscopy confirmed it. His stomach lining was inflamed and colonized by the same bacteria. He had proven it. H. pylori could survive in the stomach. It could cause ulcers. He was living proof, and more importantly, he was curable. He took a course of antibiotics. The symptoms vanished. His stomach lining healed. No more pain, no more infection. And just like that, a century of medical certainty began to crack. But science moves slowly, and pride moves even slower. Marshall and Warren submitted their case studies again. This time, a few journals listened, then more. Soon independent researchers replicated the results. In 1994, the National Institutes of Health officially recognized H. pylori as the primary cause of ulcers. By the late 1990s, the standard treatment for ulcers had shifted from antacids to antibiotics. Millions of lives changed. Patients who had lived in chronic pain for decades were suddenly cured with a few pills. Rates of stomach cancer plummeted. The pharmaceutical industry, which had profited for years from lifelong antacid prescriptions, was forced to adapt. The old theories collapsed, and in 2005, Barry Marshall and Robin Warren received the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine. But awards never told the whole story. What Barry Marshall had done was more than science. It was rebellion. He challenged not just a theory, but a system built on prestige and authority. He exposed how medicine can become dogma, how curiosity is often punished, and how truth must sometimes bleed before it is accepted. Even now, in quiet corners of medical history, his name glows like a scar, because he swallowed the poison and gave the world a cure. The hardest part about being right is proving it, not once, but 1,000 times, in the face of people who refuse to listen. After Barry Marshall drank a beaker of live Helicobacter pylori and gave himself gastritis, he didn't expect instant applause, but he thought someone, anyone, might say, "This is worth looking at." Instead, silence, and behind that silence, pressure. You see, medicine is supposed to be about evidence, but in reality, it's about hierarchy. In the 1980s,
Junior doctors were not supposed to challenge professors, researchers were not supposed to rewrite textbooks, and gastroenterologists were definitely not supposed to admit that they'd been wrong for decades, especially not about ulcers, a condition that had built entire pharmaceutical empires. For years, ulcers had been treated like chronic conditions. Patients were prescribed antacids, proton pump inhibitors, and strict dietary regimens. The idea was that ulcers couldn't be cured, only managed. This belief made billions of dollars for drug companies. Now along came Barry Marshall, a doctor no one had heard of, claiming that ulcers were an infectious disease. Not only that, they could be cured with a short course of antibiotics and bismuth salts, costing a fraction of what lifelong acid suppression did. This wasn't just a scientific revolution, it was a financial threat, and the system responded like an immune reaction, violently rejecting the intruder. Medical journals were slow to publish his data. Some refused entirely. Reviewers dismissed his findings as interesting but anecdotal. Established gastroenterologists rolled their eyes in private conversations, calling him reckless, unprofessional sensationalist. Many still believed H. pylori was a harmless commensal, an innocent bystander, not the culprit. Meanwhile, patients continued to suffer. Across the world, people endured surgeries that removed parts of their stomachs. Others lived with chronic pain, bloating, vomiting blood, the slow grind of a disease that could now, Marshall insisted, be cured in 7 days. But no one was ready to believe it. So he did what all revolutionaries must. He kept pushing. Barry Marshall and Robin Warren gathered more data. They published case series. They collaborated with international researchers. They recruited more patients and developed treatment protocols. They organized clinical trials, tiny at first, but slowly growing, and cracks began to form. In 1984, a breakthrough came from the unlikeliest of places, a pathology conference in Brussels. There, a handful of scientists from Europe and the Middle East presented independent findings, confirming Marshall's theory. They had also found H. pylori in ulcer patients. They had also seen results with antibiotics. Now it wasn't just two Australians yelling into the void. The echo had become a chorus. By 1990, the first international symposium on H. pylori was held. Dozens of papers poured in. Pharmaceutical companies took notice, not to shut it down, but to join in. Antibiotics could be repackaged. Combination treatments could be marketed. The tide was turning. In 1994, the U.S. National Institutes of Health issued a formal statement. Pylori is a major cause of peptic ulcer disease. This was the moment Barry Marshall had waited a decade for. But the war wasn't over. Even after the NIH recognition, many doctors refused to change their practice. Old habits die hard, especially when they're taught in medical school and reinforced by drug reps. Some physicians continued prescribing antacids without testing for H. pylori. Some patients were told it was all in their heads. Even when antibiotics were offered, they were sometimes given in the wrong combination, or for too short a course. Barry Marshall realized something painful. Changing the textbooks is faster than changing minds. So he shifted strategies. He began teaching, touring, speaking at conferences, explaining not just the science, but the human stakes. He told stories of patients who had been cured. He showed endoscopy photos of healed stomach linings. He made it real, personal, undeniable, and slowly it worked. By the early 2000s, H. pylori eradication became the standard treatment for ulcers in most developed countries. New medical students were taught the Marshall-Warren theory as fact. Textbooks were rewritten. The pharmaceutical industry pivoted, and in 2005, the world finally did what it should have done 2 decades earlier. It awarded Barry Marshall and Robin Warren the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine. The citation read, for their discovery of the bacterium Helicobacter pylori, and its role in gastritis and peptic ulcer disease. At the award ceremony in Stockholm, Barry Marshall gave a speech that was half victory, half elegy. He joked about being his own lab rat. He spoke about courage and curiosity, and he reminded the room of something science often forgets. Everyone was against me, but I knew I was right. Today, Barry Marshall's story is often told as a triumphant footnote, the quirky doctor who drank bacteria and proved a point. But the truth is far more dramatic. For over a decade, he faced ridicule, financial risk, and professional isolation. He could have stopped, played it safe, kept quiet. Instead, he chose the harder path. He chose to listen to the data when no one else would. He chose to believe his own eyes over the textbooks, and in doing so, he didn't just cure ulcers, he cured arrogance, at least for a moment.
The map, the pump, and the ghosts of Soho, John Snow, and the secret behind the deaths. In the late summer of 1854, death came to London in silence and in water. The cholera had returned. It crept in through the narrow alleys of Soho, slipped past the boots of factory men, settled into the cracks of stone steps and cellar doors. It struck fast and without mercy. One moment, a child was laughing, and by nightfall she was gone, her skin pale, her eyes sunken, her body drained of all life. By the end of the week, dozens were dead. By the end of the month, it would be over 600, and yet no one knew why. Not the priests who blamed God, not the city planners who blamed the poor, not the doctors who clung to an ancient theory that stank of false certainty, the belief in miasma, bad air. It was a simple explanation, comforting in its clarity. Disease, they said, came from foul smells, the stink of unwashed streets, the reek of sewage and decay. If you could smell it, it could kill you. And so, Londoners burned incense, carried flowers, and avoided the slums, even as their loved ones died in well-ventilated homes. But one man had doubts. Dr. John Snow, a quiet, intensely focused physician from York, had been watching cholera for years. He didn't believe in bad air. He believed in evidence, in patterns, in cause and effect. And he had a theory, one so radical, so blasphemous to the science of his day, that he'd kept it mostly to himself. What if cholera wasn't in the air at all? What if it was in the water? It was a question that could have cost him his reputation. At the time, water in London was beyond suspicion, or rather beyond inspection. Pumps were sacred, wells were thought to be natural and pure. Never mind that the Thames was an open sewer. Never mind that entire districts dumped waste directly into the same sources they drank from. Snow had seen too much. He'd watched patients double over in agony within hours of drinking tap water. He'd seen whole streets decimated, while others, just meters away, remained untouched. The pattern wasn't random. It was geographic. And when the outbreak hit Soho in late August, Snow knew it was his chance to prove it. But time was not on his side. The disease spread with terrifying speed. Within 48 hours of the first report, whole families were dead. A workhouse with over 500 residents remained almost entirely untouched, while an adjacent row of houses saw every inhabitant fall ill. It was chaos, yes, but not without shape. Snow saw the outline. All he needed was data, so he went into the belly of the epidemic. While others fled, John Snow walked the streets of death, day after day, hour after hour. He visited homes, interviewed survivors, and logged every fatality. He asked what no one else thought to ask. Where did you get your drinking water?
At first, the answers seemed scattered, but as the map in his notebook filled in, a grim truth emerged. Almost every death could be traced to a single source: the Broad Street pump. The pump stood at the heart of Soho, on a street corner that bustled with life. A mother pushing a pram, a coal merchant loading carts, a girl skipping rope with a cup of water in her hand. It was a gathering place, a source of pride. The water was cold, sweet, and clear. People traveled from blocks away to drink from it, and according to John Snow, it was killing them. But no one believed him. The local officials, the Board of Guardians, laughed at his map. They reminded him that cholera was in the air, that water was sacred, that his theory was speculative, hysterical even. After all, the miasma theory was backed by the greatest scientists of the age. What was Snow offering? A gut feeling? No, he was offering a death map. With every dot, he showed them that the closer a household was to the pump, the higher the death rate. He showed them that households farther away, even those in filthy conditions, were largely spared if they drank from other sources. And he had one more piece of evidence. A woman who lived miles away in Hampstead had died, a strange outlier, far from the outbreak. But Snow had visited her son, who revealed that she still had water delivered from Broad Street. She believed it was the best in London. She had it brought in by special request. She drank it. She died. Faced with the horror of the evidence, the board finally agreed, not because they were convinced, but because they had nothing left to lose. On September 8, 1854, they removed the handle from the Broad Street pump, and the outbreak stopped. It wasn't immediate. Some cases continued. The disease had already seeded itself in homes, but within days, the death toll slowed. Within weeks, it vanished. John Snow had solved the mystery, but he was not vindicated. Not yet. The miasma theory was too strong, too entrenched. Scientists dismissed the correlation as coincidence. Others argued that removing the pump had nothing to do with the end of the outbreak, that it had simply run its course. Snow published his findings. He revised his maps. He gave lectures, but the impact was limited. He was a man ahead of his time, holding a truth that the world wasn't yet ready to see. It would take decades, and the work of microbiologists like Robert Koch and Louis Pasteur, to prove that diseases were caused by microorganisms, not bad smells. Only then did Snow's work resurface, his maps re-examined, his method hailed. Today, John Snow is called the father of modern epidemiology. He introduced the idea that disease could be tracked, mapped, and predicted through population data, that public health could be preventive, not just reactive, that science must go into the street, not just the lab. But at the time, he died barely recognized. He passed away in 1858, only 4 years after the Broad Street outbreak, of a stroke. He was 45 years old. He never lived to see the full vindication of his theory, but he left behind something more powerful than fame. He left behind a method. When the handle was removed from the Broad Street pump, the dying slowed, but the disbelief didn't. John Snow had risked everything: his career, his credibility, and his standing in London's elite medical circles, to propose a theory that was both revolutionary and unwelcome, that cholera was not borne by air, but by water, not by a stench, but by something invisible, microscopic, alive. But in 1854, there was no germ theory, no microscopes that could capture the culprits, no consensus on what caused disease at all. Snow had no pathogen to show, no photograph of a bacterium, no petri dish glowing with proof. All he had was a map, a simple map. And yet, it was the first of its kind. Snow had painstakingly marked every fatality during the Soho outbreak, with a black line on a city grid, the lines clustered with chilling clarity around the Broad Street pump. Each stroke was a life: a mother, a child, a factory worker, a school teacher. When he showed it to officials, it was impossible to unsee. The Broad Street pump wasn't just a water source, it was an epicenter of death. But logic, it seemed, was not enough. The idea that a tasteless, odorless, clear liquid could be teeming with killers was absurd to most Victorians. After all, cholera was associated with stench, with the thick, choking smell of rotting refuse and human waste that hung in the London air like a curse. To them, the smell was the disease. The miasma theory had deep roots. It aligned perfectly with class prejudices. It was easy to believe that the poor, who lived in foul conditions, were the natural breeding ground of disease. Their suffering was blamed not on city planning or contaminated water, but on their own uncleanliness. Snow's theory threatened more than medical dogma. It threatened power structures. If cholera came from water, then the city's waterworks, operated by private companies with little regulation, would be responsible for killing citizens. If feces in rivers led to epidemics, then the very way London handled waste would have to be overhauled. Massive infrastructure would be needed. Millions of pounds, political backlash, accountability. It was far easier to blame bad air than bad policy. So John Snow was quietly pushed to the margins. His paper, published in 1855, made little impact at the time. Prestigious journals refused to print his maps. Medical societies rejected his conclusions. He was labeled an eccentric, brilliant perhaps, but misguided. Yet he didn't stop. He kept refining his theory, returning again and again to the patterns in the dust. He studied earlier outbreaks, finding the same waterborne links. He wrote about how cholera spread in workhouses, tenements, and ships. Always the same conclusion: follow the water. Then in a twist of fate, London itself proved him right. In 1858, the city was swallowed by an event so horrific it earned a name of its own. The Great Stink. That summer, the heat rose and the Thames, swollen with centuries of sewage, began to boil. The smell was so overwhelming that Parliament had to suspend its sessions. Curtains were soaked in lime. Offices were abandoned. Londoners wore vinegar-soaked masks. The air was unbreathable. Finally, the government acted. Led by civil engineer Joseph Bazalgette, the city began building an enormous underground sewer system to carry waste far outside city limits. It was one of the largest infrastructure projects of the century, and though no one credited Snow by name, the design was based on a quiet acknowledgement: the danger was in the water. Snow never lived to see it. He died in 1858, the same year the stink reached Parliament, of a stroke at the age of 45. His obituary was respectful but brief. There was no mention of the Broad Street pump, no tribute to his epidemiological work. He slipped into history, like the disease he fought, quietly, without fanfare. But death could not silence his maps. In the decades that followed, a new generation of scientists began to emerge, armed with microscopes, curiosity, and a desire to understand disease at the microscopic level. In 1884, Robert Koch finally isolated the Vibrio cholerae bacterium, the precise pathogen that causes cholera, and suddenly, Snow's work was no longer theory. It was prophecy. Public health officials returned to his writings and realized they had missed a pioneer. His maps, once dismissed, became blueprints. His method of case tracking, data analysis, and spatial visualization was adopted by epidemiologists around the world. Today, John Snow is remembered as the father of modern epidemiology. But the story is more than academic. It's a reminder of how long it can take the truth to be heard. of how easy it is to dismiss what we can't yet prove, of how many lives are lost not to ignorance, but to stubbornness. Even now, Snow's ghost walks among us, in every contact tracers database, in every GIS disease model, in every public health decision that begins with a question: where did it start? Who did it touch? Where is it going next? He taught us to look closer, to trust the data, to listen when no one else will.
The man who fought the invisible poison, Clair PATTERSON, and the lead conspiracy. It began with a question that no one had ever truly answered. How old is the Earth? It seems like a scientific riddle, academic, harmless, distant, but that question would lead one man to uncover a global conspiracy. It would pit a quiet geochemist against some of the world's most powerful corporations, and in the process, it would reveal a silent, invisible poison, one that had been slipping into our bones, brains, and bloodstreams for decades. His name was Clair PATTERSON, and he didn't set out to save the world. He just wanted to know the truth, that sometimes the truth is more dangerous than anyone imagines. Clair PATTERSON was a geochemist with a mind built for obsession. In the late 1940s, while working at the California Institute of Technology, he joined a team attempting to measure the age of the Earth using uranium lead dating. The idea was simple: uranium decays into lead at a steady rate. If you could isolate ancient samples of lead, truly uncontaminated, and measure their isotopic composition, you could calculate how much time had passed since the Earth solidified. But there was a problem. Every sample PATTERSON tested, whether it came from a meteorite or the Earth's crust, was contaminated. No matter how careful he was, the lead readings were always too high, too modern, too suspicious. Something was polluting his work. So, like any good scientist, PATTERSON built something that had never been built before: a clean room. At the time, it was a radical idea. He designed an airtight lab with filtered air, non-contaminating surfaces, and protocols to prevent even a single speck of dust from ruining his results. It worked. By the mid-1950s, he finally succeeded in isolating pure lead from ancient rocks and meteorites, and the number he found stunned the world. The Earth was 4.55 billion years old. It was a triumph, a headline, a Nobel-worthy discovery. But PATTERSON didn't celebrate, because in the process of chasing the planet's age, he had uncovered something far more disturbing. The contamination he had battled wasn't just a lab nuisance. It wasn't natural. It was man-made, and it was everywhere. That he continued his work, PATTERSON began measuring lead levels in other places: deep ocean cores, Greenland ice, prehistoric rocks, and comparing them to modern environments. The differences were staggering. In samples thousands of years old, the natural background level of lead was nearly zero, but in contemporary air, soil, and human tissue, it was hundreds, even thousands of times higher. Even more troubling, it wasn't evenly distributed. It spiked after the 1920s. It was rising every year. Something was pumping vast quantities of lead into the world. The source: gasoline. In the 1920s, the chemical company Ethel Corporation, a partnership between General Motors and Standard Oil, had begun adding a compound called tetraethyl lead to gasoline. The reason was mechanical. It prevented engine knocking, allowing for smoother performance in early internal combustion engines. It was a cheap solution, a profitable one, and from the very beginning, it was known to be toxic. In 1924, 5 workers at a tetraethyl lead plant in New Jersey died, and dozens more suffered from hallucinations, seizures, and psychosis. Newspapers called the facility the House of Butterflies, because workers reportedly swatted at imaginary insects before collapsing. But the companies insisted it was safe. in low doses, that it evaporated too quickly to do harm, that any concern was emotional, not scientific. They paid off experts, they funded their own research, they spread confusion, and while they profited, the world filled with lead dust. Cars belched it into the air, children breathed it. It settled on playgrounds, on farmland, in city streets. It soaked into soil and water and flesh, and still no one in government stopped it, until Clair Patterson. By the late 1950s, Patterson had connected the dots. He compared lead levels in modern human bones to those from ancient burial sites. The results were horrifying. A typical 20th century American had up to 1,000 times more lead in their body than a person from the Roman Empire. Even newborns had measurable lead in their blood. And lead wasn't just toxic, it was neurotoxic, especially in children. It damaged the brain, lowered IQ, increased aggression, impaired judgment. The effects were irreversible, but when Patterson tried to sound the alarm, the backlash was swift. Industry came for him, funding dried up, invitations vanished. He was barred from certain research conferences. The American Petroleum Institute and the Ethel Corporation launched whisper campaigns to discredit his work. They called him paranoid, unqualified, alarmist. They insisted there was no proof that environmental lead caused harm, and they were winning, because unlike Patterson, they had money, influence, PR departments, politicians in their pockets. They flooded the market with reassuring ads. They repeated their mantra, "There is no conclusive evidence." But Patterson didn't stop. He worked in isolation. He published paper after paper. He argued before government committees. He testified in public hearings, demanding independent regulation of lead in the environment. He proposed that the National Science Foundation stop taking oil industry money for lead studies, and he kept digging. In one of his most haunting findings, he showed that the lead levels in Antarctic ice, untouched for millennia, began rising in perfect sync with the rise of automobile use in the 20th century. There was no ambiguity, no mystery, just a straight line from exhaust pipe to atmosphere to bloodstream. And still, they tried to silence him. But slowly, the science caught up. Other researchers began replicating his results. Pediatricians saw the same trends in children. Urban studies showed that kids living near highways had higher lead levels, lower test scores, and more behavioral issues. The tide began to turn, and after 2 decades of relentless pressure, Patterson finally saw change. In 1970, the US passed the Clean Air Act, which empowered the newly formed Environmental Protection Agency (EPA) to regulate airborne toxins. Patterson's data played a key role. In 1973, the EPA began phasing out leaded gasoline. In 1986, the US banned it entirely, and within a single generation, blood lead levels in American children dropped by more than 80%. Clair Patterson didn't get rich. He didn't run for office. He didn't sell a best-selling book or host a television series. He just told the truth, over and over, until the world was forced to listen. To be continued in Part 2. The Fight for Silence. How industry tried to bury the truth. By the early 1970s, Clair Patterson had become something both rare and dangerous, a scientist who could not be bought. He had exposed a truth the world did not want to hear, that the entire modern environment was laced with a neurotoxin, one poured into the sky by car engines, painted into homes, and embedded in the bones of children. He'd called out the petrochemical giants, the public health agencies, and the scientific institutions that had stood by for decades, in silent complicity. And for that, he became a target. Because Patterson didn't just threaten corporate profits, he threatened credibility. He threatened the illusion that public safety was protected, that science was impartial, that the government would act when lives were at risk. He threatened the story America told itself, and so the campaign to discredit him grew darker, more organized, and more personal.
The lead lobby's disinformation machine, the Ethyl Corporation, and its allies didn't operate in daylight. Their strategy was older, more insidious. Cast doubt. They created fake scientific committees with names like the Lead Industries Association and the International Lead Zinc Research Organization, which produced glowing reports about the benefits and safety of lead. They planted op-eds in newspapers, paid scientists to give favorable testimony, and sent representatives to whisper behind closed doors that Clair Patterson was an extremist. They even tried to rewrite the narrative. If lead was found in children's blood, it wasn't the gasoline, it was lead paint in the home, or natural geological sources. If children in urban neighborhoods had higher lead levels, it wasn't from highways, it was their dirty lifestyles, or poor hygiene. Patterson recognized the pattern. It was the same logic used by tobacco companies to deny the link between cigarettes and cancer: delay, confuse, attack the messenger, pay for your own research, and above all keep the public in the dark. But what they didn't anticipate was just how stubborn he would be. The scientist as warrior Patterson became relentless. He continued his research at Caltech, running tests not just on ice cores and ancient bones, but on modern consumer products. He found lead in canned food, in cosmetics, in drinking water from old pipes. He began writing and speaking more publicly, moving beyond the language of science and into the language of outrage. In 1971, he famously wrote, "The entire human population of the United States has been experimented on without their consent. We have no data on what the safe level of lead is in children, because the experiment has never ended." This was no longer just about measurement, it was about justice. He began to campaign not only for unleaded gasoline, but for the complete removal of industrial lead from everyday life. He demanded new standards for food, cosmetics, plumbing, and indoor air. He accused his fellow scientists of moral cowardice for accepting industry funding. He named names, and it came at a cost. He lost collaborators. Former allies distanced themselves. Some university administrators pressured him to tone it down. He received letters, some threatening, others mocking. In an era before social media or independent funding platforms, speaking truth meant standing alone. But Patterson did not break. He once said, "If we are going to act responsibly, we cannot wait for absolute proof. We must act when the evidence tells us harm is probable, not just certain." It was a philosophy of scientific ethics that few dared to live by, and yet, year by year, the world began to shift. The fall of lead, the 1970s and 80s brought seismic changes, not just in public policy, but in public awareness. In 1973, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency announced a phase-out plan for leaded gasoline. Patterson's research had played a central role. In 1976, Congress passed the Toxic Substances Control Act, giving the EPA power to track and regulate hazardous chemicals, including lead. And in 1986, under growing public pressure and mounting evidence, the EPA banned the use of lead in motor vehicle gasoline entirely. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Within 5 years, blood lead levels in American children dropped by more than 50%. Within 15 years, they had dropped by over 80%. IQ scores rose. Rates of behavioral disorders dropped. The benefits touched every corner of society, from healthcare to education to crime statistics. And still, Patterson was not done. The global struggle lay. He began to warn about other countries still using leaded gasoline. He lobbied international organizations, urging the United Nations to step in. He spoke to governments in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, showing them the same data, the same maps, the same long-term dangers. It would take decades, but his vision slowly won. In 2002, the United Nations launched a global partnership to eliminate leaded gasoline. One by one, countries joined. By 2021, the last country on Earth, Algeria, finally banned leaded petrol. It was the end of an era, the era of silent poisoning, and much of it traced back to a man who simply refused to believe the lie. The quiet and Clair Patterson never became famous in the way other scientific heroes are. There were no best-selling biographies, no blockbuster films. His name doesn't appear in school textbooks. Most people who benefit from his work have never heard of him, but his impact is incalculable. He died in 1995, aged 73, after a long career, not just of discovery, but of defiance. At the time of his death, average U.S. blood lead levels were the lowest they had been in over a century, and in an even greater irony, Patterson's work had become the gold standard in geochemical analysis. The cleanroom he invented is now mandatory in high-precision laboratories around the world. Every time scientists measure trace elements in the atmosphere, the oceans, or human tissue, they're following in his footsteps. Legacy of a lone voice. Clair Patterson's life is a parable for our times. He wasn't the first to be ignored. He won't be the last. But he proved something dangerous and beautiful, that one person armed with data, stubbornness, and moral clarity can change the entire trajectory of human health, not by shouting, but by never backing down.
The man who saw the continents move, Alfred Wenger, and the forgotten earth. The world is not what it seems. Beneath our cities and forests, beneath our oceans and mountains, the very crust of the earth is in motion, vast, invisible, relentless. But for most of human history, the ground beneath our feet was considered the one constant, unshakable, fixed, eternal, until a man named Alfred Wenger looked at a map and saw a ghost. It was 1910 when he first noticed it, not as a scientist, but as a dreamer. In the flickering gaslight of his Berlin apartment, Wenger ran his fingers along the edges of a world map, tracing the bulge of Brazil and the curve of West Africa. They fit together like torn pages of the same book. The resemblance was too precise to be coincidence, and in that moment, a question formed that would define and nearly destroy his life. What if the continents had once been one? What if long ago the world had been whole, a single massive landmass that had fractured and drifted apart like shards of ancient glass? It was an idea so vast, so bold, so heretical, that the scientific world refused to hear it. But Alfred Wenger would not be silenced. Wenger wasn't a geologist. That was part of the problem. He was a meteorologist, a physicist, an Arctic explorer, a polymath who had taught himself paleontology, climatology, and cartography. In the rigid academic hierarchies of the early 20th century, that made him an outsider. Worse, it made him dangerous, because he asked questions others never thought to ask. And his most dangerous question of all was this: what if continents move? In 1912, at a scientific conference in Frankfurt, he presented his theory. The continents had once formed a single supercontinent, which he named Pangaea, from the Greek for all earth, and had since drifted across the globe. He didn't just base this on maps. He compiled fossil evidence, identical species of ancient reptiles and plants found on continents, now separated by oceans, geological formations, matching mountain ranges in South America and Africa, climatic anomalies, signs of glaciation in tropical India, and tropical plant fossils buried beneath Arctic ice. The story was written in stone, he said, but no one wanted to read it. The backlash Wenger's proposal wasn't just dismissed, it was ridiculed. Prominent geologists called it pseudoscience, amateurish, a flight of fantasy. They demanded, if continents drift, what force moves them? Wenger had no answer. He had ideas, tidal forces, Earth's rotation, but no mechanism strong enough to satisfy physics. Without that mechanism, the theory was labeled speculation,
and Wegener was mocked. His peers accused him of cherry-picking data. His credentials were attacked. His books were banned from some university courses. At conferences, his name drew laughter. In the Anglo-American world of geology, where stratigraphy and fixed crust theory reigned, Wegener became a cautionary tale, but he didn't stop. In 1915, he published The Origin of Continents and Oceans, a comprehensive and meticulously argued case for continental drift. It was rich with maps, fossil records, climatological models, and geological comparisons. It sold poorly. It was translated slowly. Most scientists refused to read it. But among a small group of outsiders, young scientists, naturalists, and Arctic explorers, it began to circulate. Because deep down, some of them sensed he was right. The explorer's heart. Wegener's courage wasn't just intellectual, it was physical. In 1906, long before his theories were born, he had joined a dangerous expedition to Greenland. He nearly died in a blizzard. He became fascinated with ice, with movement, with the great slow grinding forces of the earth. It was there, watching glaciers inch across the land, that he first began to imagine motion on a planetary scale. He returned to Greenland many times, braved frostbite, storms, isolation. He saw with his own eyes how ice could reshape a continent, carve valleys, bury forests. He saw that nature does not care for human timetables, that change can be slow, silent, and unstoppable. And that gave him a kind of faith, because while his critics demanded immediate evidence, Wegener believed that time would reveal all, that the earth, like a patient witness, would keep its secrets until the moment was right. The tragedy: in 1930, Wegener returned to Greenland one last time. He was leading a scientific expedition to study glacial movement and atmospheric data. It was a brutal mission. Supplies ran low. Weather turned. On November 1st, in the freezing winds of the ice sheet, Alfred Wegener vanished. His body was found months later, buried in snow. He died at 50. Unknown, uncelebrated, his work dismissed, his ideas derided, and for a time, it seemed he had been defeated. For over 20 years after Alfred Wegener's death, his theory of continental drift lay buried under layers of skepticism, mockery, and academic silence, as forgotten as his body beneath the Greenland ice. His name faded from textbooks, his books gathered dust, his maps were laughed at in lecture halls, and then the earth spoke, but not on land, at sea. It began, as so many revelations do, in the darkness. The deep ocean trenches, the places no sunlight touched, were being explored for the first time by sonar, seismic sensors, and magnetic survey tools developed during World War II. Submarines had made the ocean a battlefield, and in the aftermath, scientists inherited the tools of war to study the shape of the sea. What they found changed everything. The mid-Atlantic mystery. At first, the data looked like a glitch. Running down the center of the Atlantic Ocean was an enormous, unexpected ridge, thousands of miles long, rising like a submerged mountain chain. It zigzagged from the Arctic to the southern tip of Africa. They called it the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. But more shocking than the ridge itself was what lay beneath it: a rift, a crack, a seam in the Earth's crust. And around this rift, scientists detected frequent earthquakes, volcanic activity, and a strange pattern in the magnetic alignment of rocks on either side. It was as if the ocean floor was being pulled apart. That idea, once laughable, was now impossible to ignore. The magnet that rewrote the map. In the 1950s and early 60s, geophysicists began using magnetometers to scan the ocean floor. They were looking for iron-rich rocks, and they found something astonishing: striped patterns. The rocks on either side of the Mid-Atlantic Ridge had magnetic signatures that mirrored each other, black and white stripes, frozen in opposite polarity. Like a barcode across the seafloor, these patterns stretched out symmetrically from the rift, in both directions. What did it mean? That the ocean floor was growing. Lava was emerging from the rift, cooling into rock, and pushing older seafloor away on both sides. Over millions of years, this seafloor spreading had pushed the continents apart, silently, steadily. Exactly as Wegener had predicted, continental drift becomes plate tectonics. By 1965, a young British geophysicist named Dan Mackenzie, and others like him, began to stitch the data together into a coherent model. They proposed that the Earth's crust was not a single solid shell, but broken into massive slabs, or plates, that moved over the molten mantle below. They moved inches per year, but over millions of years, enough to reshape the planet. This was the mechanism Wegener lacked, the engine of drift. It wasn't tides, it wasn't Earth spin, it was plate tectonics. The continents weren't drifting on the ocean, they were part of the moving plates themselves, and the mid-Atlantic ridge. It was a divergent boundary, where two plates were pulling away from each other. Other types of boundaries were identified too. Convergent boundaries, where plates collided, pushing up mountains, or creating deep ocean trenches. Transform boundaries, where plates slid past each other, triggering earthquakes, like the San Andreas Fault in California. The theory explained everything. Earthquakes, volcanoes, mountain ranges, ocean trenches, the shape of continents, and the fossil record. It wasn't just accepted, it became the unifying theory of geology. And Alfred Wegener, once a pariah, was reborn as a prophet, the echo of vindication. But the vindication came too late. Wegener was gone. His wife Else had preserved his legacy as best she could, but his critics, those who had mocked him most fiercely, were never forced to recant. Some quietly revised their views. Others claimed they had suspected it all along, but the younger generation knew the truth. Wegener had seen it before anyone else. His name returned to scientific journals, then to textbooks. Craters on the moon were named after him. A research station in Greenland bears his name. Every student of earth science now learns the word Pangaea before they finish high school. But what made Wegener's story endure wasn't just that he was right, it was that he had been right too soon. A lesson in resistance. Why had he been dismissed? Because he wasn't a geologist. Because he lacked a mechanism. Because his idea disrupted too much. Or perhaps, as history so often shows, because the scientific establishment is slow to accept truths that arrive uninvited. Wegener's theory threatened the idea of an Earth that was fixed and stable. It challenged the permanence of borders. It blurred the line between disciplines. It suggested that what we see is not what always was, and not what will always be. That's dangerous, because it means we don't know everything. And science, though devoted to truth, is still practiced by humans, with egos, reputations, and fears. Continents still moving today, we can measure continental drift with satellite precision. The Atlantic Ocean widens by about 2.5 centimeters per year. India continues to crash into Asia, lifting the Himalayas ever higher. California inches northward, slowly drifting toward Alaska. The world is in motion. Always has been, and it took a stubborn man with a forbidden map to see it first.
The monk who decoded heredity, Gregor Mendel, and the forgotten code of life. In the quiet stone walls of a 19th century monastery, behind stained glass and chants of prayer, a secret was growing, green, leafy, and silent. It took root in soil, it spread across vines, it bloomed, wilted, and returned with the seasons. But this was no ordinary garden, it was a laboratory disguised as a cloister, and its caretaker, a humble Augustinian friar named Gregor Mendel, was quietly conducting one of the most radical experiments in scientific history. What he discovered would later be called the foundation of modern genetics, but in his own lifetime, no one believed him, no one even noticed. The world forgot his name before it ever knew it. And yet, more than a century later, every child who learns about heredity, every scientist who manipulates DNA, every doctor who maps a genome, they all walk through the garden Mendel built. This is the story of the monk who cracked the code of life and vanished before anyone understood what he had done. A world without genes. When Mendel began his work in the 1850s, the scientific world had no understanding of genes, DNA, or even chromosomes. At the time, most biologists believed in the blending theory of inheritance, the idea that traits from parents simply blended together in their offspring. A tall father and a short mother would produce medium-height children. A red flower crossed with a white flower would give pink. Traits were thought to dilute over generations, like paint swirling together, but this theory couldn't explain why traits sometimes reappeared after disappearing for a generation, or why some traits seemed to follow specific patterns. It also couldn't explain what Mendel saw with his own eyes. The hidden genius of Brünn. Gregor Mendel was born in 1822, in a tiny village in what is now the Czech Republic. He was the son of farmers, bright, observant, and poor. From an early age, he showed a gift for learning. He loved math. He memorized patterns in nature. He stared at trees, bees, clouds, and wondered, how does nature decide what comes next? He joined the Augustinian monastery of St. Thomas in Brünn, now Brno, not just to serve God, but to access books, education, and intellectual freedom. The monastery was a center of learning, filled with manuscripts and microscopes. There, Mendel found a strange and perfect mix of solitude and stimulation. He studied physics, he studied botany, and then he did something quietly revolutionary. He planted peas. The great pea plant experiment. Pea plants were ideal for experiments. They had easily visible traits, tall versus short, round seeds versus wrinkled, green pods versus yellow. They self-pollinated, but could be cross-pollinated by hand, and they grew quickly, generation after generation, in a single season. But what set Mendel apart wasn't what he planted, it was how he studied them. He applied statistical rigor, counting, calculating, testing predictions, at a time when biology was still largely descriptive and qualitative. Between 1856 and 1863, Mendel grew and catalogued over 28,000 plants. He carefully cross-pollinated different varieties and tracked how traits passed from one generation to the next. And the results, they shattered the assumptions of his time. Ratios, rules, and rebellion. Mendel found that traits did not blend. Instead, they followed precise mathematical patterns. In one classic experiment, he crossed tall and short plants. The first generation, F1, were all tall, but the shortness hadn't vanished. It was when he crossed the F1 generation, short plants reappeared in the second generation, F2, in a 3:1 ratio. This pattern repeated across different traits: green pods versus yellow, round seeds versus wrinkled, violet flowers versus white. Again and again, dominant traits reappeared in 75% of offspring. Recessive ones showed up in 25%. He deduced that traits were inherited as discrete units, what we now call genes. These units didn't merge or dilute, they segregated and recombined. Mendel had uncovered the law of segregation. Each parent passes on one of two units, alleles for each trait. The law of independent assortment. Traits are inherited independently of each other. He didn't use those words, of course. The language of DNA hadn't been invented, but he had written the rules on paper, in ink, in perfect ratios. And when he published them in 1866, he thought he had changed the world. Silence. He sent copies of his paper, Experiments on Plant Hybridization, to the top scientists of Europe. There was no reply. At first he waited, then he grew discouraged. His fellow monks didn't understand the math. The biologists dismissed it as a curiosity,
or worse, didn't read it at all. Some criticized his unnatural manipulation of plants. Others said peas were too simple to prove anything fundamental about life. The blending theory persisted. Darwin, still alive, never read Mendel's work, nor did Thomas Huxley, nor did Ernst Haeckel. The paper received 0 citations in Mendel's lifetime. By the 1870s, Mendel gave up his experiments and turned to administrative duties as abbot of his monastery. He died in 1884, at age 61. His notebooks were stored in boxes, his plants were uprooted, his formulas, so carefully constructed, disappeared into obscurity, and for the next 35 years, the science of heredity wandered in darkness. For 35 years, Gregor Mendel's work lay buried, not physically, but intellectually. His paper, published in 1866 in the Proceedings of the Natural History Society of Brünn, was gathering dust in obscure archives, unread, unreferenced, untouched. There were no scientific debates about it, no controversy, no mention in textbooks. It wasn't rejected by his peers. It was worse than that. It was forgotten. In the grand salons of biology, Charles Darwin still reigned. The theory of natural selection was evolving, but without a mechanism of heredity. Scientists still leaned on the blending theory, even as it clashed with evolutionary logic. How could traits blend forever, generation after generation, without losing their distinctiveness? How could natural selection favor individual traits, if those traits dissolved in every child? But the missing answer was already written, in ratios, in records, in a monastery garden. And then, in a strange twist of fate, 3 scientists, working independently in different countries, stumbled across the same forgotten paper. The year was 1900, and Mendel's resurrection had begun. The triple discovery. Hugo de Vries, a botanist in the Netherlands, was studying mutations in evening primrose plants when he noticed something odd. Certain traits didn't blend. They jumped generations. He began drafting a theory of discrete inheritance, but as he prepared to publish, he found a citation in an old reference list, a footnote to a paper by G. Mendel, 1866. Curious, he tracked it down, and his heart must have stopped. There, in dense but precise German, was the theory he was about to claim. Not only similar, identical, with experiments, with math, with the same conclusions. He realized he had been beaten by a man who had been dead for 16 years. But de Vries wasn't alone. Within weeks, Karl Correns in Germany and Erich von Tschermak in Austria, both working on plant hybrids, also rediscovered Mendel's paper. All 3 announced the same thing: we have not discovered this. Mendel did, and we owe him the credit. In a stroke of scientific honesty, rarely seen in competitive fields, they each acknowledged him, and suddenly, Mendel's name was reborn. A scientific awakening. The effect was electrical. Geneticists and botanists across Europe began to read the long-ignored paper. It was as if Mendel had risen from the grave to hand them the answers they'd been searching for. Within 5 years, his laws were mainstream science. New experiments with flies, corn, and mice confirmed his ratios. His concepts, dominant and recessive traits, innulus, segregation, and independent assortment, became the scaffolding of a new discipline. In 1905, British biologist William Bateson coined the word genetics, and he did so in direct homage to Mendel. In 1907, Mendel's original garden at the Abbey of St. Thomas was declared a historical site. In 1910, statues were erected. Scientists who once doubted the possibility of discrete inheritance now hailed Mendel as a genius, a visionary, a prophet of biology. But as Mendel's ideas took root, a new mystery bloomed. Why had no one listened? Why had such a precise, testable, revolutionary discovery gone unread for so long? Some blamed disciplinary bias. Mendel was a monk. He wasn't part of the elite scientific networks of the 1860s. He published in a local journal, in German, with no fanfare or institutional support. Others pointed to scientific fashion, Darwin's theory dominated biology, and anything not clearly supportive of natural selection was pushed aside. Mendel's math-based biology didn't fit the mold, but perhaps the real reason was simpler. The world wasn't ready. In the mid-1800s, the idea that traits were encoded in invisible units was too radical. The tools to visualize chromosomes hadn't been invented. The language of molecules didn't exist. Mendel's math was too precise for biologists, and his biology too strange for mathematicians. So the world closed its eyes, and Mendel died thinking he had failed, a foundation for the future. But now that his ideas were recognized, a scientific revolution began. In 1915, Thomas Hunt Morgan and his team at Columbia University confirmed that genes reside on chromosomes, using fruit flies. In the 1930s, Mendel's laws were integrated with evolutionary theory, creating the modern synthesis. In 1953, James Watson and Francis Crick discovered the double helix structure of DNA, the molecule that carries Mendelian instructions. In 2003, the Human Genome Project mapped the entire genetic code of our species, a direct descendant of Mendel's garden notebooks. Mendel's laws became the bedrock upon which entire industries were built: modern agriculture, molecular medicine, ancestry testing, forensic science, genetic engineering. And yet, the man himself remained a mystery. The paradox of Mendel: he never left his monastery. He never knew the world would remember him. His notes suggest he was a private, careful, deeply thoughtful man, fascinated by order, patterns, and nature's hidden rules. He suffered from periods of depression. He doubted his own work. He struggled with the politics of the church and the academy. In his later years as abbot, he dealt with legal disputes, crop failures, and monastery debts. He wrote almost nothing about his pea experiments again. Yet from the moment his fingers crossed pollen between two plants, something had changed. He had touched a truth larger than himself, a blueprint woven into every living thing, and even in silence, the code waited.
It began with a telescope pointed at the stars, and ended with a man whispering truth under his breath as the world tried to silence him. His name was Galileo Galilei, and in the early 1600s, he looked into the night sky and saw something that shattered the foundation of human belief. Planets moved in ways they were not supposed to. Moons orbited a distant planet, not Earth. The heavens, once thought to be perfect and still, were in motion, chaotic, alive. And at the center of it all, Earth was no longer king. It was a discovery that would make him a hero of science and a prisoner of faith, because to reveal that the Earth moved was not just to question astronomy, it was to challenge the divine order. The world before the telescope. To understand the war Galileo ignited, you must first understand the world he was born into. The year was 1564, the same year Michelangelo died. The Renaissance was in full bloom. Art flourished. Philosophy stretched its wings. But when it came to the structure of the universe, one idea ruled: the geocentric model, based on the teachings of Aristotle, and later codified by Claudius Ptolemy. This model placed Earth at the center of the universe, unmoving, and surrounded by a series of perfect celestial spheres. The stars were fixed in the outermost sphere. The planets, including the Sun, orbited Earth in circular patterns. This wasn't just science, it was doctrine. It aligned with Christian theology, which taught that God had placed man at the center of his creation. To question it was to question Scripture, and for centuries, no one did. But cracks had already begun to form. The ghost of Copernicus, in 1543, just 21 years before Galileo's birth, a Polish mathematician and canon named Nicholas Copernicus had published a book that would change the cosmos forever. De Revolutionibus Orbium Celestium, on the revolutions of the celestial spheres. In it he proposed something radical, that the sun, not the earth, was the center of the solar system. This heliocentric model placed Earth among the planets, orbiting the Sun along with Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. It explained retrograde motion, it simplified planetary calculations, but it conflicted with theology and lacked observational proof. Copernicus died shortly after publication. His theory was quietly ignored. Some called it a useful fiction, others called it heresy. It would take another mind, bolder, sharper, unafraid, to make the heavens speak. That mind was Galileo's, the telescope and the turning sky. In 1609, Galileo, then a professor in Padua, heard rumors of a new Dutch invention, a glass tube that made faraway objects appear closer. He didn't just build a copy, he improved it, and then for the first time in history, a human turned a telescope toward the sky. What Galileo saw would shake the very structure of belief. The moon was not smooth and perfect, as Aristotle claimed, but rugged, pocked with mountains and craters. The Milky Way was not a glowing band, but a dense collection of countless stars. The planet Jupiter had 4 moons, orbiting it, not Earth. Venus showed phases, like the moon, proving it orbited the Sun, not Earth. Each observation chipped away at the geocentric model. In 1610, he published Sidereus Nuncius, the Starry Messenger, a short electrifying pamphlet that made him famous across Europe. But fame cuts both ways, friends and enemies. Galileo was not just a scientist, he was a showman. He wrote in Italian, not Latin, so that common people could read his ideas. He debated publicly. He mocked the Aristotelian professors who refused to look through his telescope. He had powerful friends, including Cosimo de' Medici, the Grand Duke of Tuscany, whom he flattered by naming Jupiter's moons the Medicean stars. But he also made enemies. Many academics were enraged, not only at his conclusions, but at his tone. He was brilliant, but arrogant. His critics couldn't beat him in argument, so they began to appeal to authority, specifically the Church. And by the early 1600s, the Catholic Church was in no mood for cosmological rebellion. The Protestant Reformation had shattered religious unity. The Council of Trent had reaffirmed the Church's authority in all doctrinal matters. The Inquisition stood ready to suppress heresy, and the idea that Earth was not the center of the universe, that was not just science, it was heresy. The warning in 1616, Galileo's writings drew the attention of the Roman Inquisition. The Copernican model was declared formally heretical because it contradicted the Holy Scriptures. The Book of Joshua, after all, said that God made the sun stand still, which only made sense if the sun moved around Earth. Galileo was summoned to Rome. He was not excommunicated, but he was warned, explicitly, not to defend or teach heliocentrism as truth. He returned to Florence, chastened but not broken. For the next several years, he turned to other topics, motion, mechanics, tides, but the fire still burned. And when a new pope, Urban VIII, a former admirer, was elected in 1623, Galileo saw a narrow opening. He stepped back into the war, the book that broke the silence. In 1632, Galileo published his masterpiece, Dialogo sopra due massimi systemi del mondo, dialogue concerning the 2 chief world systems. It was structured as a conversation between 3 characters: Salviati, who argued for the Copernican system; Simplicio, a defender of Aristotle and Ptolemy; Sagredo, an intelligent layman caught between them. Though presented as a neutral discussion, the book was not subtle. Salviati, the Copernican, clearly had the better arguments. Simplicio, the geocentrist, came off as bumbling, slow, even foolish. To make things worse, Urban VIII, the Pope,
believed Galileo had mocked him by putting his own arguments into Simplicio's mouth. The book was banned. Galileo was summoned to Rome, and this time there would be no warning dottle. The summons came not as a letter, but as a command. In 1632, Galileo Galilei, now nearly 70 years old, and suffering from chronic illness, was ordered to appear before the Roman Inquisition. His latest work, Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems, had crossed a line, not a scientific one, a theological one. The Pope, once his admirer, had turned against him. His old friends at the Vatican were silent. The Jesuit scientists, once intrigued by his telescopic findings, now looked away. What Galileo had done was unthinkable. He had made a fool of the earth-centered universe, and by extension of the Church. And so, in the chill of winter 1633, Galileo was transported from Florence to Rome, not as a guest, but as a prisoner of thought. He was about to stand trial, not just for a book, but for the idea that the earth moves. The Inquisition. Galileo knew what the Inquisition was. He knew what they had done to Giordano Bruno, the philosopher who had proposed infinite worlds and had been burned at the stake in 1600, just blocks from where Galileo now stood. But Galileo had something Bruno didn't: fame, powerful patrons, and evidence. He believed that would protect him. He was wrong. The charges. The Inquisition charged Galileo with violating the 1616 edict, which had forbidden him from teaching or defending the Copernican system as truth. They accused him of heresy, of teaching that the sun stood still and the earth moved, ideas that contradicted Holy Scripture. Galileo responded with caution. He insisted that the dialogue was not an endorsement of heliocentrism, but merely a philosophical exploration. He pointed out that he had received official permission to publish the book, which was true. But the Inquisition was not interested in nuance. They demanded a confession. When he refused, they threatened him with torture. And at last, the man who had pointed his telescope at the stars, who had defied kings and scholars, who had revealed moons and mountains and motion in the heavens, broke. On June 22, 1633, in a dim hall of the convent of Santa Maria sopra Minerva, Galileo knelt before the tribunal and read aloud his abjuration, a formal, humiliating recantation. I, Galileo Galilei, do abjure, curse, and detest the aforesaid errors and heresies. With those words, he was spared the rack, but not punishment. The sentence: Galileo was sentenced to house arrest for life. He was forbidden from publishing. His books were banned. He was labeled vehemently suspect of heresy. The Church ordered him to recite the 7 penitential psalms every week for 3 years. A dozen copies of his recantation were sent to universities across Europe as a warning. And so the father of modern science, the man who had changed how humanity saw its place in the cosmos, was locked away in his villa in Arcetri, near Florence. There, under surveillance, half-blind and aging, he faded from public view, but not into silence. Per si move, according to legend, as Galileo rose from his knees after recanting, he whispered the words, per si move, and yet it moves. Historians debate whether he actually said it. The phrase doesn't appear in any court records. It was first attributed to him decades later, during the Enlightenment. But true or not, the words ring with poetic defiance, because even if Galileo had been forced to deny the motion of the earth kept moving. Under lock and lens, during his years under house arrest, Galileo remained intellectually active. With fading eyesight, he dictated to loyal students and scribes. He turned his attention from the stars to mechanics, to motion, acceleration, falling bodies, and in 1638, smuggled through friendly networks, he published Dialogues Concerning Two New Sciences, laying the groundwork for what we now call physics. In it, he formulated the principle of inertia, theorized about terminal velocity, and began defining the rules of motion, rules that Isaac Newton would later refine. He also described what we now call the parabolic trajectory, the curve of a cannonball or an arrow. Galileo could no longer gaze at the heavens, but he could still calculate their laws. His final years were filled with pain, isolation, and a world that had turned its back on him. He died in 1642, blind and under house arrest. The church buried him quietly, denying him a public grave for fear that his name might become a symbol of resistance. But symbols cannot be buried for long, a dangerous legacy. In the centuries that followed, Galileo became a myth, a martyr, a warning, and a rallying cry. To Enlightenment philosophers, he was the patron saint of reason. To revolutionaries, a man who stood for truth against power. To scientists, the first modern physicist, the man who united observation with experiment, who dared to trust his instruments over his inheritance. He had rewritten the book of nature, with math, with vision, with fire, and the church. They kept his books banned, until slowly, the earth shifted again.